Thank you both for being here.
Thanks for having us.
I'm Danielle Pletka. I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. My guests need no introduction, but I'm going to give them one anyway. Representative Mike Lawler represents New York's 17th congressional district. Prior to serving in the House of Representatives, he represented New York's 97th district in the State Assembly. Representative Ritchie Torres currently lives in the Bronx. That's the first line of your bio. Currently lives in the Bronx. So I guess that...
I did not write the bio.
I'm just wondering why they decided to lead with it. And you represent New York's 15th in Congress. He's a member of the Committee on Financial Services and the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party. The reason they're here today has nothing to do with the Bronx, or maybe a little bit to do with the Bronx, but the proximate reason that we asked you to join us is because together you are going to introduce a bill called, very cleverly, the Columbia Act. And we haven't seen the text yet, but our understanding is that this bill is a response to the explosion, I think that's the right word, of anti-Semitism on college campuses. I know it's shocked all of us who have seen it. I pulled up some statistics. Total reported anti-Semitic incidents on college campuses since October 7th, 1,584. That was as of May 13th. That's a 700% increase. I want, if you both would, for you to talk a little bit about what the bill contains, what it mandates for the Department of Education, and all of the details that you'd like to share with people. You two fight out who wants to start.
Sure. I guess I have more seniority, so I'll start. I think the context is important. So, for me, October 7th did not change the state of anti-Semitism in higher education. It revealed a trend that has been a long time in the making. And I've become convinced that there is a deep rot of anti-Semitism at the heart of American higher education, as evidenced by the encampment movement. And I've come to conclude that Title VI enforcement has fundamentally failed in relation to combating anti-Semitism. The Office of Civil Rights within the Federal Department of Education is simply too disconnected from what is happening on college campuses and too chronically under-resourced to be an enforcement mechanism. And so the purpose of the Columbia Act is to provide an enforcement mechanism where none exists, to empower the Federal Department of Education to appoint a monitor at the expense, not of the taxpayer, but the college or university. And to have someone who's on the ground, who's seeing the facts on the ground with their own eyes, and who can provide an enforcement mechanism where none exists. A wise person once said, if you do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result, that's the definition of insanity. I think we have to come to grips with the fundamental failure of Title VI enforcement in relation to combating anti-Semitism on college campuses.
So one of the things that really pleased me about this event and about your prospective legislation is the fact that this is bipartisan. We don't see a lot of bipartisanship anymore, and this is really an important step. Congressman Lawler, talk a little bit about your perspective on it. Why do you want to be part of this effort?
Well, I'll say this. I was proud yesterday to be named by the Lugar Center as the 4th most bipartisan member of Congress. And it's in part because, folks like Ritchie and I are willing to work together and to find solutions to major challenges facing the country, despite the fact that we come from different areas in New York State and different political parties and perspectives. But understand at our core, the only way to advance change is if you're willing to actually engage in substantive conversation with people you may disagree with and find the commonality. Look, to Ritchie's point, the issue of anti-Semitism is not a post-October 7th phenomenon. This is something that has been going on college campuses for years. The BDS movement has been given so much oxygen on college campuses, as we're seeing currently. You look back to last year's CUNY Law School graduation speech, where the student spouted off a whole litany of anti-Semitic propaganda, and I introduced a number of bills in the aftermath of that starting with the Stop Anti-Semitism on College Campuses Act, which would go after the federal dollars of these institutions of higher learning that promote or sanction anti-Semitic events on their campuses. I introduced that right after that law school graduation speech. Last year, Ritchie and I and Josh Gottheimer and Max Miller and a number of other members worked on the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. This is a bill that was in the works long before October 7th, but we introduced it after October 7th and fought for the last 6+ months to get a vote on it. And just 2 weeks ago, we were able to get a vote on the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which would require the Department of Education to adopt the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism and its contemporary examples for its Title VI discrimination enforcement cases. And to the bill that Ritchie and I just introduced, a few weeks ago, the Columbia Act, again, it's, to Ritchie's point, it's about enforcement. It's about providing the Department of Education with the tools necessary to ensure that anti-Semitism does not run rampant on these college campuses. These college administrators, these presidents, have failed miserably in their responsibility to keep the students safe and to ensure that, yes, allow for robust debate, allow for free speech, allow for discussion and protest. But the moment that those protests turn violent, either physically or verbally, you lose that right. And these institutions have a responsibility to crack down on it. And the legislation that we have put forth and worked on together over the past year is really aimed at making sure that the federal government does its job to enforce the law.
So are these going to be mandatory requirements of the Department of Education, or are you still really just giving them the authority to do what it is?
It would function no differently from any other monitorship, right? There's nothing unusual or unprecedented about monitorships. Police departments, labor unions have been subject to federal monitorships, and higher education should be no exception, but it would not happen in every case. If there's a reason to suspect that a particular college or university has a pattern or practice of harassment or discrimination against their Jewish students, then the DOE would have the authority to impose a monitor.
Understood. So the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, that passed 320 to 91. We can call that a good bipartisan result. I'm not entirely sure of what's going to happen to it in the Senate for a variety of reasons, but what interested me was not the 320, although we should celebrate that, but the 21 GOP members and the 70 Democrats. As we talk about the provenance of this anti-Semitism, and you're right, the October 7th ripped the mask off. This was something that was bubbling beneath the surface for a long time. We saw it at places like CUNY. We absolutely saw it in the BDS movement that is so prevalent throughout the United States. But where is this bubbling up from? Why did 70 Democrats and 21 Republicans vote against the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act? And how can that help us understand where some of this is coming from?
Look, the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism is broadly recognized as the acceptable definition of what anti-Semitism is. 36 states have adopted it. Numerous countries have adopted it. The United States has utilized it going back to the Obama administration, the Trump administration, the Biden administration, with respect to the State Department. In 2019, President Trump put in place an executive order, and what the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act does is codify that executive order into law. Many of my colleagues on the right have attacked me that I wrote a bill to ban free speech and ban the Bible. It's idiotic. I am a practicing Catholic. I'm not looking to ban the Bible or limit anyone's ability to practice their faith. But very clearly, these institutions of higher learning have failed to address the issue of anti-Semitism. And part of the challenge has been, frankly, a lack of understanding of what anti-Semitism is, which is ironic considering you would think academia would be able to understand it better than most, but clearly they can't. And so what we are trying to do by passing this law was to give more clarity. Now, I'm frankly more focused on the fact that we had 320 agree on this issue. That is overwhelming broad bipartisan support and recognition that this bill is necessary. I understand people have free speech concerns. I understand people may not agree with every example that is listed as part of the contemporary examples. That's fine. We can have that robust debate. But at the end of the day, this bill is necessary. Senator Schumer is the highest-ranking Jewish official in American history. In my opinion, he has a responsibility to bring this to the floor for a vote. And I think it has overwhelming bipartisan support in the Senate. It will pass overwhelmingly in the Senate. I think almost all of the Republicans in the Senate would support it. And I am not concerned about it not passing if it comes to the floor. The only reason not to bring it would be politics.
Okay, let's talk about politics, Mr. Torres. What about your 70? So I host a podcast with my colleague Mark Thiessen, and Mark and I often have this discussion. And Mark says that the problem of anti-Semitism in the Republican Party is a problem, but it is a fringe problem. In the Democratic Party, it's becoming a more mainstream problem. I'm not sure he's right, but I'd love to know what you think, especially in regard to those 70, and why it's not coming up in the Senate.
I would not assume that all the 70 Democrats who voted against it are anti-Israel or anti-Jewish. A number of my colleagues had concerns, First Amendment concerns about the legislation. Mm-hmm. But I feel like there are misconceptions about the bill. So the bill is essentially defining anti-Semitism within the context of Title VI. Mm-hmm. The purpose of Title VI is not to target speech, but to target conduct, harassment, discrimination, intimidation. So it defines anti-Semitism, but it does not change the definition of harassment, right? So the notion that it's going to censor Christianity or ban the Bible is an absurdity. It ignores the nature of Title VI. There's a difference between prohibiting anti-Semitic speech and prohibiting anti-Semitic hate crimes. No one would claim that a prohibition of a hate crime is a prohibition of the speech itself. That same logic applies to Title VI. There's a difference between prohibiting anti-Semitic speech and prohibiting anti-Semitic harassment or discrimination. We're targeting harassment. In order for there to be a Title VI violation, it's not enough to show anti-Semitic speech, nor is it enough to show anti-Semitic harassment. You have to show that the harassment is so pervasive and so objectively offensive and so severe. Systemic, and that's a high standard. And so that rigorous standard remains unchanged with the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. All it does is it defines anti-Semitism. Look, the law prohibits anti-Semitic harassment. So the question is, who gets to define it? Should it be the people's representatives in Congress, or should it be bureaucrats in the Federal Department of Education? We feel like it's more democratic for the people's representatives to define anti-Semitism.
Absolutely. There was another element that people called out, which is that they were fearful that it would stifle criticism of the state of Israel.
The legislation is essentially a codification of the executive order on anti-Semitism.
The one that Trump wrote and that
one
Biden
that Trump,
kept in force.
And these critics cannot cite a single case in which that executive order led to the suppression of anti-Israel speech.
Well, and I think what's also important to point out is within the IRA working definition and its contemporary examples, it makes very clear that any criticism of Israel that is of the same nature of criticism of any other government is not anti-Semitic. And so that is the fundamental point. If you're criticizing Israel simply because it is a Jewish state, that is different than criticizing the policy decisions that are made by the Israeli government, in the same way that we have people constantly protesting decisions made by our government. That is part of our nation's history. That is part of our constitutional freedoms. That is wholly acceptable. But when that criticism is targeted specifically to criticize Jews because of decisions made by the state of Israel, or just criticizing the state of Israel because it's a Jewish state. That is the problem.
Demonstrating, for example, at Hillel or Chabad, or stopping Jewish events from happening because of Gaza.
But I just think this whole debate is disingenuous, right? Because very few people are absolutist in favor of free expression, right? None of the people who are screaming free expression believe in neutral enforcement of those principles, right? If those encampments were advocating a view that offended them, they would be advocating for the shutdown of those encampments in a heartbeat.
Look, we had, during the last administration on these college campuses, we had safe spaces. So the idea, again, to Richie's point, that there's even enforcement of this, or that people embrace it when it may go against things that they disagree with, is wrong. And again, the objective is not to limit free speech. It's not to stop robust public debate. It is to ensure that others' constitutional freedoms are not infringed upon, and that their physical safety is not harmed. That's the objective.
Let's talk a little bit about enforcement. We've been through a few years of, let's call it, social unrest in a very generic sense, both under the Trump administration and now under the Biden administration. It is hard for me to understand why enforcement has been so tame, that you needed to do this, right? You are not giving new authorities or forcing authorities on the Department of Education that they could not have sought for themselves. Is this really, as you said at the outset, Mr. Torres, a money problem, or is there a will problem as well?
It's both.
Why?
I think we lack the enforcement resources, but there's also a lack of political will. There's a lack of look, the IRA definition is orthodoxy among the leading Jewish organizations throughout the country, but it's controversial in American politics, right? I mean, a former mayor, Bill de Blasio, I remember, once said that anti-Semitism is an exclusively right-wing phenomenon. Like, there are people who deny that there's anti-Semitism on the far left. There are people who deny that anti-Zionism is or can be a form of anti-Semitism. And so there's a disagreement about the nature of Jew hatred in American society.
And that is reflected in the Department of Education's own enforcement actions?
I think there are people who believe that if you are uttering phrases like the Intifada,
Intifada,
from the river to the sea,
from the river to the sea.
Or we don't want 48, we don't want 2 states, we want 48. If you're uttering those phrases, if you're calling for the destruction of the world's only Jewish state, there are people who believe that that's within the realm of legitimate discourse, that there's nothing remotely anti-Semitic about that. I obviously disagree, but that's...
No, and you've both been unbelievably forthright. Let's talk about where this...
But again, I think that's a double standard, because if you had, you spoke about the CUNY law school graduation speaker, if you had a student who called for the destruction of Puerto Rico, everyone would agree that's anti-Puerto Rican. If you call for the destruction of the Dominican Republic, everyone would agree that's anti-Dominican. So why is it permissible to call for the destruction of the world's only Jewish state? Why is that not anti-Jewish?
Well, from Massachusetts to California, we should call on Black Americans to go back to Africa. I mean, if I said that, would I get in trouble?
That would be racist, yeah.
It would be racist, yes. And it is racist, so exactly. The analogies offer themselves up, but for some reason, Jews have been an accepted class in the treatment of minorities, and I'm grateful to you for trying to end it. I'm still trying to figure out where this comes from. Where, you both talked about this being a phenomenon that existed before October 7th, right, which is 100% true. Where is this coming from, this Jew hatred?
Well, obviously, the hatred of Jews goes back millennia.
Don't start there.
But that obviously is a reality to deal with. The Jewish population in the United States is 2.4% roughly. New York has the highest concentration of Jews in the world. My district has one of the largest Jewish communities in America. Ritchie has a high concentration as well in Riverdale. we understand the dynamics, frankly, in some respects, I think better than most, and appreciate the challenges that the Jewish community has faced. And you see, ultimately, what we are seeing on these college campuses is a level of hatred borne out, in large part, in my opinion, from a hatred of Jews, period. And it is the BDS movement is absolutely anti-Semitic. It is absolutely rooted in a hatred of Jews. This is not about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is rooted in a hatred of Jews. And I think ultimately the objective, whether it is racism, whether it is homophobia, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, the objective has to be to educate people and get them to understand, in a much more compassionate way, what people are dealing with. You don't have to agree on everything. We're not going to agree on everything. But the criticism and the debate can't be rooted in a hatred of someone. It has to be rooted in a philosophical difference on the substance of the issue. And we can disagree on, you look at an issue within the LGBTQ community and the issue of trans women in women's sports. It can't be rooted in a hatred of trans people. It has to be rooted in a discussion around the issue of women athletes and the impact on Title IX. That is certainly, in my opinion, a debate and a discussion to have. But if it's just rooted in a hatred of somebody because of who they are, then no, that's wrong. That's not what the discussion should be centered around.
And it's not what we stand for in the United States.
Even though anti-Semitism is an ancient hatred, I see anti-Zionism as the latest mutation in the DNA of anti-Semitism. And the two disproportionate drivers of virulent anti-Zionism in America have been academia and social media. I feel like the ideas like decolonization and intersectionality originate from college campuses, but it's social media that enables those ideas to permeate outward into the broader society. And I'll share a personal story. When I've been traveling to Israel for about 10 years, and when I first announced that I was going on a delegation to Israel, I became the target of overwhelming vitriol and hatred even 10 years ago. And there was a rally on the steps of City Hall against me. I was a New York City Council member at the time. And I remember coming across one activist who had a shirt that read "Queers for Palestine," which caught my attention. And so I asked the activist, I'm just curious, what is your opinion of Hamas? And I honestly thought the activist was going to tell me, well, I support Palestinian rights, but of course I object to Hamas. And instead she said, no, I support Hamas because Hamas is fighting for the liberation of the Palestinian people from Zionist occupation. And at that moment I was in a state of shock. I had the beginnings of an epiphany. I said, the fact that an LGBTQ activist could defend a terrorist organization that systematically and savagely murders LGBTQ people, that to me was as definitive a sign as any of the utter stupidity, absurdity, and moral bankruptcy that the BDS movement has inflicted on progressive politics. And over time, I came to realize one of the most powerful ideas on college campuses is the idea of intersectionality, which holds that you cannot be both progressive and pro-Israel. That in order to be pro-LGBTQ and pro-Black and pro-immigrant and pro-every progressive cause that I care about, you have to be anti-Israel. And that has been it's a powerfully seductive concept.
It is.
Just to echo something, I mean, ultimately, the anti-Zionist movement, to Ritchie's point, is the latest fad within anti-Jewish, anti-Semitism. And you see how often Israel is blamed for blamed for the plight of the Palestinian people, blamed for what goes on in the Middle East, blamed for whatever ill in the world, and the BDS movement itself trying to boycott, divest, or sanction, Israeli companies and businesses, and it is really just, to the point, rooted in a hatred of Jews. There's no other way around it. Because if anybody came forward and said that they were going to boycott, divest, and sanction, name the country, and it was rooted in the fundamental fact that it was an Arab country or a black country or a Hispanic country, the hysteria would be nonstop, and understandably and justifiably. But somehow, with respect to Israel,
I think
it's not.
We might have a slight disagreement here. I think
Thank God.
There you go. We get a disagreement.
I actually think there's nothing wrong with advocating for boycotts and sanctions. The problem with the BDS movement is that it's not seeking to change the policy of the Israeli government. It's seeking the destruction of Israel as a Jewish state, right? And
right. If it's rooted
Yeah.
in a policy disagreement, we put sanctions in. I just passed the SHIP Act, putting sanctions in on Iranian petroleum because of their conduct, not because of the fact that it is a Muslim state. It is their conduct, and that is the fundamental issue here. The BDS movement is rooted in anti-Zionism.
I have a question about other origins of this. Certainly,
You're asking two non-Jews about the origins of Jew hatred. That seems,
yes. Well,
this is like a skit.
it is, and about as funny as Saturday Night Live has become. But
although I did love the Kenan Thompson skit about Columbia University, but
that was hilarious.
I said that's how my constituents think.
I'll bet. No, this is not a hard question, a hard biblical question about the origins of anti-Semitism and Jew hatred. This is a little bit about the role that outside groups are playing. A lot of people have focused, just because we're in DC and because the GW encampment was so big, so appalling, and because, of course, the government of the District of Columbia for a long time refused requests of the police to come in and disband that until the folks at the encampment had a kangaroo court in which they called for the president of GW to be guillotined. That got their attention. There's nothing like, apparently, a guillotine to get your attention in modern days. But they arrested 33 people. Only 6 of them were students at GW as a result of that. I don't know how representative that is on other campuses, but I think it raises the question not just about the role of outside groups like Students for Justice in Palestine, like the American Muslims for Palestine, but also the role of foreign governments. Yes. And this is what I'm curious about. Talk a little bit, if you would, about what you see as their role.
Much is said about the monetary influence of AIPAC, which is the great boogeyman. AIPAC's resources pale in comparison to Qatar. I feel like most countries have a sovereign wealth fund. Qatar itself is a sovereign wealth fund. It has no real population it's governing. It has nothing but an abundance of energy resources and money. And we've seen Qatari money pour not only into higher education, billions of dollars, but even in K-12 education. There was a public school in Brooklyn where the Qatari Foundation was funding an Arab heritage program. Obviously nothing wrong with an Arab heritage program, except there was an image of the Middle East where Israel was wiped off the map. And so there's been—
In a New York City public school.
And when I asked the chancellor, why would you allow this to happen? He said, I can't vet all the educational materials that go into the classroom. I said, well, can you vet the ones that are coming from the Qatari Foundation? Can we start there? I don't understand.
But this is a real question. So there are at least basic reporting requirements. Certainly in the Higher Education Act, Section 117 requires that institutes of higher education, not K through 12, report donations from foreign countries. Are we all? They don't do it, of course. There's no compliance.
I feel like we should seriously consider banning them.
Yep.
I would argue we should ban, and maybe this is legislation we'll work on, ban foreign dollars either from China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, and maybe countries that finance terrorist organizations like Hamas. But Qatari influence has become too glaring to ignore in higher education.
And I think, look, long term, we're going to have to deal with the fact that you have a supposed ally that has basically been housing Hamas leadership.
Not just Hamas, Al-Qaeda, the
Yeah,
Taliban, ISIS.
it's a real problem, and it needs to be addressed in a serious way. I think one of the things that we've looked at in this Congress, and Ritchie's on the China committee, you have the Chinese purchasing land in the United States near sensitive military bases. You have foreign dollars flowing into our education system for obvious intent. It's not for generosity. And so I think as a nation, we have to look at the fact that we are in the most precarious place since World War II. You have an unholy alliance between China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, that is seeking to undermine and destabilize the United States, Israel, and the free world. And the question is, how are we going to deal with that? The supplemental aid package was critical to support our allies in a moment of a very trying time. Helping Ukraine, supporting Israel, deterring China in the Indo-Pacific, and supporting Taiwan. I think we fundamentally have to look at what is actually happening in the world. Some of the stuff we focus on as a country at times, frankly, is stupid. As opposed to what is actually happening in the world and the threats that we have to deal with. Sitting on foreign affairs, sitting on the select committee on China, we're both on financial services. These are very serious, substantive committees that we're trying to deal with real challenges. And yet, the attention and the notoriety tends to go to some of our colleagues who have no interest in addressing real issues. It's unfortunate because to the point about bipartisanship, there actually is a lot that we can agree on and that we can get passed and signed into law if the institution would actually allow for it and stop getting so caught up in the partisan rancor and allowing the lunatics more oxygen.
Well, amen to that. So, not to imply that everybody in the audience is a lunatic, but let me allow you some oxygen. Always a felicitous way with words. Two pieces of housekeeping. One, please raise your hand to ask a question. I'll call on you. Please do state your name and your organization and put your brilliant and short statement in the form of a question. And second, just a heads up to everybody, we do unfortunately have a hard stop. We had a little bit of a late start because of the vote, but we have a hard stop at 3:30, and I have promised these very kind gentlemen that we would escort them out before the audience leaves. So if you would be nice enough to wait when we do that. All right, have at it. I've had all this time. This gentleman back here. Oh, hey.
Good afternoon. Chris Isham with CT Group. A question just to follow up on Representative Torres' point about the links between certain progressive organizations and clearly Islamist organizations here. Are you surprised by those links, and how important and significant do you think they are from an organizational or tactical point of view?
I mean, I'm not sure if I could speak to those links in particular, but just my sense is, the irony is, and for me, it's not only about anti-Zionism. Like, it's a trinity of anti-Zionism, anti-Americanism, and anti-capitalism. Mm-hmm. The head of the People's Forum, which is a not-for-profit closely associated with the Democratic Socialists of America, which, by the way, received, I think, Goldman Sachs facilitated a multi-million-dollar transfer to the People's Forum. The executive director said that the destruction of Israel will be the final blow to capitalism. And so all of it is interconnected. And the question I ask myself is, why are capitalists planting the seeds of their own decline? Like, why do we have mainstream foundations and government agencies subsidizing institutions that are vehemently anti-American, vehemently anti-Israel, advocating for extreme positions like the abolition of policing in society. Like there are corporations and foundations that are subsidizing anti-American extremism. It's not only foreign government. Much of it is made in America and subsidized by America. And I think we should start to be more thoughtful about where we allocate our dollars, both publicly and privately.
Can you answer your own question, though? Why are they? I mean, why is Goldman Sachs doing that? Just not to pick on them particularly. But
Well, I think there's a willful blindness to anti-Semitism. There's this, like I heard this about the encampment movement. These are kids whose heart is in the right place. Yeah. They just want the Palestinians to have a state. Never mind that the explicit mission of Students for Justice in Palestine and within our lifetime is the violent destruction of Israel by any means necessary. All of that is ignored. So I think there is willful blindness, willful stupidity that's governing much of American society.
Awesome.
I think the Russians call them useful idiots.
Yeah.
Well, there are apparently a surfeit of them. This young man here.
Hi, I'm Zach Kessel from National Review. Thank you both for being here. On the Columbia Act, one of the problems with a lot of these committees on anti-Semitism at universities is that, like my alma mater, Northwestern, which has not been great recently, it was used to provide cover for anti-Semites. There were people on the committee who had signed on to statements praising Hamas immediately after October 7th. How do you make sure that doesn't happen with these monitors at the universities?
That the monitors themselves don't become a tool of, right. Yeah. Look, again, there's no perfect solution in any of this. I think what we have seen over the past many years, however, is a complete failure on the part of these school administrators to crack down on this. And there's a lot of reasons why, but this has always, I believe this has generally been allowed to persist under the guise of the Israel-Palestinian conflict, okay? And that this is rooted in a discussion about, borders, basically. And so under that guise, these school administrators have allowed this to occur. I think the objective both of the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act and the Columbia Act is to give the Department of Education more teeth to really crack down on Title VI and to say, here's the definition that you should use, here's the definition that these school administrators should be using, and if they are incapable of doing it, here's giving you a tool to impose and monitor to go for the purpose of enforcement. To Ritchie's point, this is not a new concept, the federal monitor. We have a federal monitor at NYCHA. The objective is to put somebody in who is obviously substantive, knowledgeable, serious about the issue, and can enforce the law. And I think if given the tools, I would like to think the department would take it very seriously and make sure that the person that they are appointing is there to enforce the Title VI provisions under the 1964 Civil Rights Act.
I think there's also, there are other nexuses as well. The fact that a lot of these organizations that are operating on campus, as you both have said, have ties to terrorist organizations, to organizations that have been shut down by the US government, by the Treasury Department, for providing material support for terrorism, is something worth thinking about.
When Hamas, Iran, and China are endorsing your protest, there's a problem.
Not just offering scholarships.
Yeah.
Well, you know
So
what?
the Houthis are offering scholarship if anyone's interested.
As long as it's in Yemen, I'm good with it. Yeah. But it is interesting.
It's a maritime scholarship.
There you go. But as long as these universities are providing a platform for organizations that, for example, are not allowed to operate in the United States. Yep. Ben Lefkowitz, my research assistant, was telling me today about an organization that has been banned from the United States because it was providing material support to Hamas, that is now operating out of Canada, that is being hosted on college campuses virtually. we need to look at amending what material support is to providing communications technology and propaganda for these guys. Sorry, I stuck my nose in again. Yes?
Thank you, Christian Forstner, Germany, with the Hans Seidel Foundation. Thank you first for all your work.
Speak up, Christian.
Yes. So thank you for your great work. I think what we see behind this anti-Semitism is also a generational conflict. And the perception of Israel is as a perpetrator today and not longer as a victim. And this is partly due to a reduced knowledge of the Holocaust. So what would you recommend among the younger generation? What would you recommend to increase again the knowledge about the Shoah?
Well, I would like to think that greater awareness of the Holocaust would lead to greater empathy for Jews, but it's not clear that that's the case. And it seems, and others have made this point, that the manner in which we teach the Holocaust, when you decontextualize and universalize the Holocaust, you lose sight of anti-Semitism's particularity. That anti-Semitism at its core is a conspiracy theory, but if you just see it as one prejudice among many, one form of bigotry among many, then you've lost sight of the true evil that inspired the Holocaust. And so I feel like there's been a fundamental miseducation about the true nature, the conspiratorial nature of the Holocaust. So I think it would have to be properly taught. But look, the ideology of the new left, I consider myself a liberal Democrat, which I think is different from a leftist, but the ideology of the new left divides the world into two categories, right? The oppressor and the oppressed, the powerful versus the powerless. And so if you're viewing the world from that perspective, in your mind, Israel is the oppressor that can do no right, and Hamas is the oppressed that can do no wrong. And that's the simplistic, distorting lens through which the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is seen increasingly in the eyes of Generation Z.
And I would just say, to Ritchie's point, when I was in the state legislature, I fought to get a bill passed that was being blocked by the State Department of Education. They did not want the bill to pass. And it was a requirement on them to conduct a study to determine whether or not the Holocaust is being taught and what materials are used. And myself and the Republican minority on the Education Committee forced the bill through. We picked off a handful of the Democratic members to override the chair. And we got it passed, and it ended up getting signed into law. I think there's no question, the Holocaust is being taught, but it is not necessarily being taught correctly. And I think that Ritchie makes a very astute point that, number one, what materials are being used to actually teach it? What is the framework by which it's being presented? I was in my 5th day of freshman year of high school on 9/11. There's not a kid in high school today that was born on 9/11. 9/11 is not required to be taught in schools. Should be, but it's not. And so, to me, this is a fundamental issue of how are we presenting this to children today? You look at what happened on October 7th. Those children in Gaza are taught to hate Jews. They are taught to want to kill Jews. That is being taught. And by the way, U.S. tax dollars going to UNRWA, prior to October 7th. That's why we have stripped those tax dollars away, and should. And UNRWA, as far as I'm concerned, should be disbanded completely. But education is critical, and how it is being taught is obviously important.
But I also think we're being taught to hate ourselves.
Oh, God, yeah.
I mean, we have social media platforms and college campuses that are indoctrinating the next generation, not only with a hatred for Israel, but also with a hatred for their own country. And I've said, I'm aware of no civilization in human history that can succeed on the strength of self-loathing. Yep. Like, I know nationalism can often be a dirty word, and anything in excess can be dangerous. But every country needs some degree of nationalism and some degree of patriotism. And as a liberal Democrat, I refuse to cede patriotism to the right. No political party should have a monopoly on patriotism. Like, we should take pride in America as the greatest country on earth, right? I think Bill Clinton put it perfectly once. He said, there's nothing that's wrong with America that cannot be cured by what's right with America. And so I think we need to recover the story of America as a more perfect union.
Well, amen to that. Let me ask you, and forgive me, I'm going to bogart the mic for the last question because it's something I should have asked you at the outset. The president has had a visible change of policy and stand on the question of Israel and the Palestinians since October 7th. For months, he was truly stalwart. The Joe Biden that I knew when I worked at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for so many years. He has, since January, more or less, been drifting in another direction. Not so much of criticism of policy, but with a clear view, to my mind at least, to the election in November, including halting the transfer of certain munitions to Israel a couple weeks ago. Can I just get, first of all, you, Mr. Torres, since you're a Democrat, and this is a Democrat who's looking for re-election, looking and worried about the votes that he's getting from Democrats, Michigan and elsewhere. Do you think he sees this correctly? And what do you think of the policy changes?
You want to discuss the merits or the politics?
Both. But quickly, because you have to leave.
Yeah, that's yeah.
Time's up.
Look, I disagree with a number of the statements that have been made by the president and the vote, the abstention from the UN resolution. I thought was a terrible mistake. But I see those as aberrations on an otherwise pro-Israel presidency. You know, he was the first president to go to Israel in a time of war, sent not one but two carriers to the Eastern Mediterranean. And he has been fundamentally pro-Israel at considerable cost to himself because there is a visible, vocal anti-Israel wing in the party. But I disagreed with the president's decision to go on CNN and announce that he was withholding aid from Israel. You know, I feel like there should be tough conversations between Israel and the United States, but it should be held in private. Like, we have to recognize there are two wars unfolding. There's the war in Gaza, but there's the information war on social media. And if we are signaling to the world that American support for Israel is waning, we should ask ourselves, is that going to deter Hamas, or is that going to embolden Hamas to perpetuate the war and to delay the release of the hostages? And the question answers itself. And so I feel like the administration should be mindful and should remember that the far left is far more representative of the alternate reality of Twitter than the real world.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
In the interest of collegiality, I won't be too harsh, but I
appreciate that.
I think I think it's unconscionable what is happening right now.
Not too harsh.
I think it's unconscionable that I thought the president, by and large, was very strong on Israel in the aftermath of October 7th. I think he, had really provided strong support and leadership. I am, however, deeply disappointed in the last month, both with Senator Schumer's comments on the Senate floor, former Speaker Pelosi calling for Benjamin Netanyahu to resign, the president going on CNN the other day and announcing, withholding of ammunitions, and the decision to not vote at the UN on the resolution. The UN just yesterday revised the death toll. Now, this death toll that has been provided by the Hamas Ministry of Health for months has been at the core of the basis for opposition to providing aid to Israel. These numbers have been manipulated to turn the world against Israel, to say that Israel is the one that is killing innocents. And yet the United Nations, this beacon of anti-Semitism, just yesterday revised that count significantly downward, significantly. And so I think what I hope is that the administration will put aside the electoral concern of Michigan or Minnesota or other states and focus on a very simple fact, which is something that President Bush said immediately after October 7th. The world stands with Israel in the aftermath of October 7th. The moment they defend themselves, the world will turn. America must stand shoulder to shoulder with Israel. Harry Truman recognized them 11 minutes after their founding. 76 years later, they are under direct threat, and we must not waver.
Can I actually?
Please.
'Cause obviously,
Go ahead.
I'm just like you, unequivocally pro-Israel, but I do feel we do have a romanticized history of the U.S.-Israel relationship. There's this notion that there was unconditional support for Israel until Joe Biden came along, and obviously that's not, Eisenhower, Reagan, Nixon, Bush Jr., Bush Sr., we're all tough on Israel. In fact, I think Bush Jr. Pressured Israel to end the Second Lebanon War. After about a month, the international community pressured Israel to enter into a ceasefire with Hezbollah, which has led to the present crisis in the north. Up to 100,000 Israelis have been displaced.
In
So,
defense of
Yeah, yeah.
the
Oh, please, go
historic
ahead.
narrative, though, you are completely right. And there is a lot of romanticization, including, by the way, of the Truman decision, which was not made with the ease that has been described. But it was none of these objections to Israeli actions were, A, in the aftermath of an attack of the scale and nature of October 7th, and none was in the environment, the explosion of global anti-Semitism that we've seen. I think this is what has distressed you.
And I think a new
and
dynamic
all of
too,
us.
and I think what's different about this moment is for the first time, we have a wing of American politics that is genuinely anti-Israel, that is seeking the destruction of Israel as a Jewish state. And I feel like we should not capitulate to that extremes. We should stand up.
That's where the concern is for me. Again, the robust debate, public policy debate, we should always have that. And there are people within, American politics who have always been against war, who have always been against U.S. involvement in other countries, and those voices will continue to persist. But I think in this moment, with what is happening in the world, and again, it is not just Israel in a silo, it's not just Ukraine in a silo. It is the fact that we are in the most precarious place since World War II. And this alliance between Russia, China, and Iran is thriving. And we are at a pivot point. And either the United States will lead or the United States will falter. And I just fundamentally believe in this moment, it is incumbent on the president to be unequivocal.
Well, with those words, those fine words, I think I feel comfortable in saying that Congress would not have a 7% approval rating if you two were in charge. So please join me in thanking Congressman Torres and Congressman Lawler. And wait while I